patrons, boom, 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 boom. Am I kind of pointing in the right direction? Yay! Who keep the little project alive. We've kind of a busy show, and I'm starting kind of as early as possible because I have to get to bed early to do the things that I'm going to be describing to you in due course. So this is the inaugural episode of a book that's not Replacing Darwin. It's Jeanson's Traced, which I only have in a PDF version, but that will be good enough. And we'll be going through all of the somewhat smaller source list relating to that and finding out where exactly he's using stuff and whether or not everything that's cited is actually in the reference bibliography and whether or not the reference bibliography matches up with the sources and all that little fun and game stuff along the way. Traced is Jeanson's epochal book, according to Ken Ham, that will show that our human species and population distribution have occurred. Hello, Barbara. Early in the time after the flood and not thousands and millions of years ago in our origins. Needless to say, this has not made any headway, even particularly in the creationist community. It's kind of landed like a dull thud, where Robert Carter and others who are also geneticists are going, yeah, no, I think you need to go back to the drawing board on this one. So we'll be going on. Oh, hello, Worlds Command Cyborg. The other little thing that's lying in wait, that's the reason why I'm doing the show kind of early, relates to the fact that today, Monday, which is now early morning, about 10 o'clock this morning, in Rathdrum, Idaho, a creationist ministries international speaker, a low little fellow on the totem pole, so far down that Joel Duff didn't even know who he was. And I only had one source in my reference bibliography from him from quite a few years old on theology that he co-wrote with somebody else on creationism. And apparently they did their main thing on Sunday, but there's one more speech that's going on Monday this morning. And it's on dinosaurs and fossil evidence. Well, gosh, I'm kind of aware of dinosaurs, and I love them a great deal, and I know a great deal about them, and I'm aware of the evolution evidence and fossil data beyond dinosaurs, so it seemed to be perfectly appropriate. Plus, they aren't charging for it, so I can go in free. It's invited free to the public, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to be going there with a couple friends that we will be attending and seeing what it is, and we will report the skivvy as to what occurred when we get back on the next show next Monday morning. I'm curious to see what kind of demographics, how many people are there, young, old, how many are completely buying into what's being told, and what is he exactly going to say? Since he's bringing up dinosaurs, fossils, I would be gobsmacked if he didn't bring up the soft tissue matter, which is being a drumbeat all through the creationism field, ICR, AIG, and all the rest. So I would be thunderstruck, and he would be bereft. He would be pathetic if he had not done that. Also, I'm sure he's going to be arguing that birds aren't dinosaurs, and there therefore can be no feathered dinosaurs. So I have assembled some stuff that I'm going to be taking with me as crib sheets precisely to forestall the potential issues. So I'll have at hand material from Evolution Slam Dunk, from the rocks were there that Jackson and I did. I culled the information out of the chart. For those of you who have the book, boom, 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 you'll be familiar with all of this. I compiled a listing of the 35 genera of theropods that are known directly from fossils, and pulled out from my reference bibliography the various sources relevant to them, so it'll be right there as a potential handout. And some of these predate Archaeopteryx and all that. So the field has just moved on enormously. And if all the fellow can do is to try to do what Answers in Genesis is still trying to do, which is to wave Alan fiducia from years gone by to saying it's just collagen fibers, it's not actually feathers. No, this ain't going to cut it, not in 2023. The next little zinger are stuff that actually is in the new Rocks Were There Too that I'm currently writing. So the soft tissue matter, I culled out some of the charts that when that book comes out, you'll get all of this delicious information, which is coordinating or what various soft tissue claims have been made, and what papers are involved in them, and matters of how long organic remains can last, and all that kind of stuff. And that also is quite an extensive reference bibliography that relates just to that little issue, including a bunch from dear old Brian Thomas, who I'm specifically going to be prepared to be able to dump on. Of course, he's over at ICR rather than CMI. But Thomas is the big drum beater. The majority of the various stuff on the soft tissue crap has been material related to Brian Thomas. And the other example of their star, Armitage, he's a sidebar, because I'll want to discuss, whether or not the Triceratops horn that he supposedly found stuff in is actually a Triceratops horn. But the core issues have to do with the fact that all of these samples are microscopic in size. There's not like a big slab of meat that people have found organic tissue in preserved, which you would think would be possible if everything is only 4,300 years old, and some of these are fabulously preserved. Why isn't anything like a mummified mastodon or a Ötzi, the Iceman, that was found frozen? Why aren't you finding huge amounts of DNA the way we do with Neanderthals that live more closely? And that's another area where the genetic information and all that is in play. So I did that. And then for the triple whammy, a question that I will be curious to ask both the speaker tomorrow and the people in the audience to see if they have the issue is, when did the flood happen? And I am expecting him to offer the standard 2348 BCE date that Bishop Usher has. That is the approved version at ICR and at AIG. However, in the course of the research for all of the new book and cataloging all the material, as I alluded to in volume 1, there's a little bit of squishiness as to when the flood supposedly took place. And one guy in particular, Brown, managed to move it 1,000 years in the course of just 2 years of his own research, and so it occurred to me, wait a minute, shouldn't we have like a easy way of seeing all the various offerings for the dates? And that's a chart that's going to be in volume 2, which is a compendium of things. You'll notice that there's an awful lot of listings on there, and they cover a couple thousand years of spread. And the stuff up on the top of the chart in particular is stuff that's determined from the various Bible versions, the Masoretic and the Septuagint and all that. And depending upon when you date Adam's creation and the like, you can come up with widely divergent dates. And all of them are way before 2348 BCE, Usher's bit. So Usher's version is kind of asymmetrical in relation to this. It's closer to the Masoretic text, but again, it depends on how you fiddle with it. So is he aware of that controversy at all? And to what extent has he tried to deal with it? That's going to be stuff that I'm going to be dealing with the fellow and finding out the demographics and all of that. So we will report all that skivvy next week. It's been a busy week for me. Just Friday last, EWU had their kind of belated Darwin Day thing, which now they've gotten back to having conventional lectures rather than having to do things on Zoom and all that, which they had to do during the pandemic. At any rate, this one, as every single one of the lectures that they brought in people are just absolutely marvelous. And they're purely scientific topics. They don't deal with culture camp issues. There's never done a thing where they're discussing creationism or anything like that, although a lot of the people in the audience and that are not unaware of the controversy in that, but that's not what comes up in any of the Darwin Day lectures. And the one here was by Vikram Chandra regarding his work on ants and the development of cooperative behavior in ants. How do certain ones like army ants develop the things that they do? Can they work out how this is happening from an evolutionary point of view and test it experimentally, for partly because they have a devil of a time trying to get test species to run, because these animals live out in the wild, and so you can't fiddle with them all that easily. So they managed to work their way down to get some operational species that can be tested experimentally to give them different environments to work in and see what's going on and see how the behavior runs. And it relates to a couple papers that he did, one in 2018, which we'll be putting the link up for, and the 2021 paper that was just done at PNAS on the evolution of the mass attack mode that you find in army ants and the experimental work that they have done to do that, to work out how that's happening. That's just part of the lecture that he did. He also went into the issue about what it means to develop nervous systems and brains. And not the only one, I'm not putting a link in on it, although it is kind of available from somewhere, but it's not open access. How William Morton Wheeler, way back in 1911, had first suggested that the ant colony functions like a single organism. Instead of being composed of little individual neurons in brains and the like, being run by a nervous system, it is able to make sophisticated behavior and make decisions and all that as a collective bit. And there's been a lot of work, including stuff by Chandra, researching that very element. And so in a very literal sense, and I fielded this with Chandra afterwards, is it fair to say that a brain, like one we have, is an ant colony where the parts are all clumped together in one blob rather than pieces that can run around with little mouths and legs and do things independently? And yeah, that's kind of it. And so you can view the development of complex neurosystems and decision-making, both in terms of the ant that doesn't have a conventional brain as a centralized authority, versus, or is the whole colony the organism and the brain? And it's just operating in a completely different dynamic and yet can make sophisticated activities. He also went into quite a bit on the evolution of brains and where they kind of fit in. And a particular paper that he didn't, I don't think it's open access, so because it just came out recently. Proceedings of the Royal Academy of Sciences kind of snitty on a lot of this stuff. But one paper that I found that was relevant to this was on a neural architecture in SCL flatworms. And that group was pegged by Chandra as the midpoint, the kind of transition zone where the kind of basic brain system is being developed into, and it has a variety of range to it, to the much more differentiated, sophisticated structure that it becomes dominant both in arthropod brains and in especially vertebrate brains along the line. And so if you try to look up how creationists deal with these issues, good luck, because cognitive issues and the development of brains and neurons and all of that, apart from little hit and runs to say how wonderful and magnificent everything is, for all practical purposes, they don't deal with it at all. And so that's part of the side element there. So anyway, that will be part 2 of the fun and games that's going on. Part 3, or the normal part 2, relates to some cosmology stuff that was presented by, let me zip down here. Back in November of last year, a new name popped up on the creationism field at CMI, Bruce Lawrence. And I'll be putting the link into that on creation and the Big Bang. And he's trying to downplay all those new Webb telescope images that are just expanding our understanding, and it's designed basically to kind of look back into the window in like a 300 million year period early in the universe that you couldn't see in the Hubble because they had to build specialized instruments to be able to see in the particular wavelength that would enable them to do that. James, I'm related to Banana Plant down at, oh, hello, SFT. Have you ever started fact-checking sources? You really should try doing that sometime because you haven't done it so far. Anyway, boy, and you're up early in the morning or up late, depending on the circumstances. Anyway, Lawrence was drawing on some creationist spin, a 2015 thing from Hartnett, and Hartnett was basically repeating himself. He was riffing off a slew of stuff, including some Wikipedia posts, which was kind of chintzy, and basically skating around the issue that going on about dark matter is not the same thing as demolishing the Big Bang. those things are different data fields in terms of establishing what's going on with them. And Hartnett is either oblivious to this, which I can't believe. He's knowledgeable enough. He must realize that this is a tendentious argument, but who knows? And one of the older sources that Hartnett riffed off was the venerable chestnut Whelan 2005, which I'll also be putting the link to, which is on Secular Scientists Blast the Big Bang, which is, oh, yes, remember to like and subscribe and all that jazz. Yes, put all that up on there, and we'll see what's going on. We operate out in the hinterlands here at the Evolution Hour, and but we do our best. And Whelan was basically replaying a bunch of authority quotes by the, at that time, already dwindling blob of Big Bang contrarians, as if they were representing main players in the field. And of course, to trot it out in 2005 was a bit of a push. But to keep using it in the 21st century, farther down the line in 2023, is absolutely silly. Because if you look at how that little blob, that there was a letter that came out from a bunch of the contrarians, did a letter saying, we're having doubts about the Big Bang. It has not fared well in terms of the actual science. And so things have moved on. And oh, that's why. Oh, we love each other from afar. Lawrence also drew on a few secular commentaries, not technical papers, just secondary commentary. There's one from Jackson Ryan in 2022 on CNET, and Alexandra Witza 22 at Nature. Perfectly fine ones. I'll be putting the links up to that, but nonetheless, it's still far from the technical issue. And as I remember, I'm standing. You may be too young to remember old style television sets, maybe barely. NTSC was only phased out in 2006. That's the old CRT style television sets that everyone have had in their living room. If you tuned to a TV channel that was non-operational or had gone off the air and back before the 24-hour service bit, hello, Purple. Back before then, channels would actually stop broadcasting, in the wee hours of the morning. If you tuned to one of those, you would get what we called snow, which was just a sprinkle of things. And if you had the TV sound up, it would be shh. As it turns out, I had in my house a Big Bang observatory, as every single person who did that had, because some of the little sprinkles going across the screen were in the microwave range, especially up in the upper channels, that was in that spot that was the hiss of the Big Bang. And the reason why this is so important, please take note standing. The reason why this is so critically important for understanding what's going on is that when Fred Hoyle coined the term Big Bang as an insult way back in the days, he was saying, okay, if this Big Bang has taken place, eventually the universe would have all been compressed into a single little blob, and it would have had all this particular energy, and we can calculate the black body radiation from this. And therefore, as it expands, that radiation would inevitably cool down, so that if the Big Bang had happened, you would find a cosmic background radiation in the microwave range everywhere in the universe. It would be ubiquitous, and it wouldn't exist in Hoyle's steady state model. It would only exist if and only if, for those of you who know mathematical logic, that's a both ways logical conditional, that only if the Big Bang had happened would you find this particular cosmic background radiation. And quite serendipitously, not long after, in the 1960s, Penzias and company actually found the hiss of the Big Bang in exactly that range. It was, from some people trying to work out better communication in the microwave at Bell Labs, and they kept on getting this damn hiss on their detectors, no matter where they put it. Now, it turns out things are even more interesting in the fact that hiss has a little teeny wobble to it. In other words, some areas are a little bit more hissy than others, and that suggests that there was some deformation or something interesting that was going on early in the universe. And in fact, I made a comment to Sabine Hassenfelder on her show that she was doing about unsolved physics problems and the like, saying, dark matter, which, by the way, is the supposed issue that was being brought up by Hartnett in that 2015 paper. Dark matter may not be matter in at all. it may be what we're looking at with the deformation of the universe, possibly when matter and antimatter annihilated early in the universe, and it kind of crinkled things as the universe was expanding. And what we're seeing with dark matter is the leftover matter coagulating preferentially in these slightly warped spaces, and that's why we have these big superstructures in the universe and that. Anyway, Sabine did not dump on it. She says we should talk, and so we'll find out whether or not they'll kind of think that through as a potential possibility. But all of this stuff is way above my grade, as I'm a historian, not a physicist, and the lack of impact that Hartnett and the other creationist astronomers have had in the regular scientific community. They do publish papers occasionally. Even Hartnett continues to do that, but they're very careful about how they word them, et cetera, and so forth and so on. But anyway, that's a little side digression. So the main theme then we have to deal with has to do with starting to dive into dear old Jeanson. And I suppose SFT could tell us whether or not he's ever tried to do a source analysis for Jeanson's 2017 book, or will be doing so with this 2021 book, Traced, or not. Not simply repeating Jeanson's talking points, which, by the way, the new Traced book is very much within that frame. It is a somewhat shorter book than Replacing Darwin, and it has a smaller source base, as I noted last week. It's only got a couple hundred references in it. This time, at least, he has a bloody bibliography, which means I know what he's citing before I find out where and on what points he's citing it. But he doesn't start off, it's 206 sources, which is less than one citation per page, which is lower even than the 1.4 value that we were getting from his seemingly more technical Replacing Darwin. This one is definitely less technical because a huge blob of it, a third of his source list are general books on the histories of people, and often older ones, some newer, but an awful lot older. Over half of his list are technical papers, 117, but fewer works, only 47, date from after the 2017 date of the earlier book. So it's an interesting thing to see whether or not he's just kind of paddling his little dogma barrel away from the material. One particular paper that had came up quite significantly in the criticism, and I alluded to it along the way, of a paper by Fu et al. On human genetics and working out mutation rates and so forth. And Danster and Cardinale has called attention to it. I mean, it's been one that's been pointed out. Amazingly, it is not in the reference bibliography of his 2021 book, even though it came out quite a few years ago and has been a big subject of criticism. He cites a whole slew of his own responses to critics, but does not list any of the critics that he's responding to. So that's another fascinating thing. He may allude to them in the webpage issues because he doesn't apparently put webpage stuff in the reference bibliography. So we'll find out that as I plow through bit by bit. I did notice, first of all, one of the things that jumped out at me, and I'm alluding to it in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, has to do with the fact that he jumped onto the Wallam Olam bread record mess, which is just a ridiculously dangerous thing to do, because this thing was a 19th century hoax that has been recognized as such by virtually everybody except an extremely narrow group of people. And Jeanson has now jumped on that bandwagon, arguing that his compressed version of human evolution post-flood reinforces the idea that this red record might actually be a legitimate work. And I'm going, no. We'll be covering that in considerable detail in Rocks Were There too, because we're going into the various legends about flood stories around the world and how they have been misrepresented and mangled and cherry-picked by creationists. And then we'll, of course, we'll be including all of the juicy stuff about the Egyptians, and as well as a nice detailed background of the various Babylonian tales, Ziusudra and Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. The Gilgamesh tales is only the last version, and it became like a propaganda tool as one regime passed on to another, so they would expropriate the legends of previous cultures. And it's highly likely the chronology and the details fit well with the idea that the Hebrews picked up the story along with the Babylonian creation story during the Babylonian captivity, and eventually incorporated lots of elements of that into their particular versions that ended up codified as the written Bible quite a long ways later. Anyway, there's about the only website that he sticks in the reference bibliography is one from Roger Young, which I'll be putting a link to, which fulminates on the Mormon Church and others. He's apparently an anti-Mormon, and he's got, and I think this other aspect is probably the reason why he's showing up in Jeanson's references, is that it's got quite an extensive section praising James Tour on the origin of life issue, which is something that normally circulates around in the intelligent design community. So it'll be intriguing to see if that's exactly what's coming up on that. And yes, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which at the very end of his bibliography, Jeanson informs us, quote, was also heavily consulted for historical information, unquote. Now, not that the Encyclopedia Britannica is not a reliable source within its boundaries, but it's also not a replacement for technical literature, and particularly even scholarly technical literature. It's maybe useful, as any encyclopedia is, as kind of an opening gateway, but it ain't going to go too much on that. Oh, yes. Yeah, that's actually an excellent point. Although we have some interesting exceptions to that. The nuke work, there was just a special on it on Nova a bit ago about the Amazonian culture and how we now know that they were domesticating crops. So that's, by the way, another issue about all of the stuff that's going on in the New World that is really amazingly difficult to compress down into that young Earth creation, a super fast migration from Ararat across the Bering Strait, because they've got domestication of crops in that back 10,000 years. Here, and Amazonia is included in that, and they do manioc and they're very late to the corn issue, and there's a long because that's coming up in Mesoamerica and then spreading like wildfire around afterwards. It's some of the Maya only got into it like 2000 BCE, something around in there, but most of the other culture in the areas had done it earlier. But anyway, they developed their own particular ways in Amazonia, which up until recently had been thought to be completely uninhabited except by little stray cultures with dart guns and the like, and headhunting. It turns out that there were an awful lot of people that were living in that area. And they developed a very different way of doing agriculture on little raised mounds. They can even see today the dried up areas where they used to live that look like chevrons. And it's just amazing. The archaeology work and the stuff that's been done with modern LIDAR has been absolutely spectacular. And so we're rewriting an awful lot about that. And that just puts more stuff for the young Earth creationists not to pay attention to. The kind of biogeographical migration data that you can see in enormous detail in the regular scientific literature. There is no counterpart of any level of detail in the creationist community, and that would include Jeanson's book. It's going to be fun to see. One of the things that we'll be alluding to in Rocks 2 has to do with his gobsmackingly preposterous ideas. One of the things that got Carter worried about the conclusions of the book, that he has haplotypes and areas in people in the New World that are so recent. If you just pull that stuff compressed, take the material, because basically all he's doing is parasitizing the regular genetic data. He's not coming up with any of this data on his own. He's just lifting the material from the various technical papers, which of course relates to over thousands of years. All he's doing is arbitrarily telescoping it so that it's all supposedly related after the flood. Well, if you do that, you start having things that happened quite a few thousand years ago happening really, really recent. They're relatively recent. In other words, something that was happening 4,000 years ago is almost current compared to a data field that runs 30 or 40 or 50,000 years. And so you're getting stuff that's happening quite a long time ago occurring recently. Well, one of the things that Dan Stern-Cardinale pointed out, it's just hilarious, is that in one of the papers that Jeanson was aware of, he has a particular haplotype occurring about in the Renaissance, post-Christian, recent in Italy. The problem is we've got Neolithic people going back 8,000 years or so. I'm trying to remember the number right off the bat, where it has that haplotype. And the reason why we know that is because they can get the DNA data directly and the blood data directly. So it's absolutely hilarious. That's the pyramid issue is one that it's not so much that comes up in the young earth creationist mindset, but it does come up in the ancient astronaut and the I keep on always forgetting the bloody hell name. Occur to me. He's part of that ancient astronaut super sense, and there's a little section of it on in Rocks were there, but it's not just the Maya, it's also Teotihuacan outside of Mexico City. And it's anywhere, if anybody piles anything up as a mound, well, it all has to be done because they, not necessarily Egyptian travelers, but space aliens who apparently were teaching people how to pile up mud brick or stone. La-di-da. Boy, they can't figure out doing anything better like antibiotics or teleportation or something is really kind of useful. No, they don't do that. They don't even come up with YouTube. The main problem is, of course, that as anybody who has studied the pyramids know, oh yes, just because white people didn't do it, that's another matter. There's just a tremendous undercurrent of white European superiority in the whole issue, which comes up in this these recent cases of ancient astronauts and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the thing that's so interesting about it is that the way pyramids were built and the way ziggurats were built and the way Mesoamerican pyramids were built are completely different. The way the stones are put together or mud brick stuff are put together, and the fact that in a shortcut, most of the Mesoamerican pyramids are built as little mounds, and they keep on layering new mounds over them, so they get bigger and taller as you go along. Sometimes they will be used to bury somebody in the bottom, and then you keep on adding stuff up. So when you're looking at most of these large pyramids, you're actually seeing the current construction level of like a Russian doll setup. Totally different from the way the Egyptians did it. And the proportions, the relatively steep-sided things versus the really steep-sided or the really shallow, everything, nobody looking at any of those pyramids other than the fact that they're pyramid-ish would see any continuity to them. And a whole bunch of people, including the nutballs at the ancient astronaut crowd that pops up on the History Channel and all of that, just keep repeating this shtick over and over. Graham Hancock, that's who I was trying to think of. Gosh, yes, Graham Hancock. He's done this idiotic show on Netflix or Showtime or somewhere or other. Joel Duff, or not Joel Duff, but see, my mind is going. It's very late. Feder at Real Archaeology. A Hot Cup of Joe is, I think, the website that he has on it. He did an absolutely scurrilously detailed analysis because he's an archaeologist, so it's his field, and he can point out all of the little claptrap that's in there. But Hancock flirts with a whole slew of stuff, including relying on some people who are just out and out racists. And Hancock is either too dim to know this, which is entirely possible if you've heard of a lot from Hancock, or goes ahead anyway. Anyway, all of that's going to be giving some discussion in the Rocks Were There, because there's just the interconnections of the flood tales with cryptozoology and the ancient astronaut crowd, the super duper biblical superculture, and this is beyond just Christian creationism. There's an Islamic creationist who insists that Noah's Ark was atomic powered and that they had cell phones. So, it's just an amazing blob of stuff when your jaw is dropping and you're going, no. Yes, the pyramids. One of the fellows, Lerner, I think his name is one of the big archaeologists who has studied a lot of pyramids, and he's written some excellent books on it. You see him popping up every once in a while. And so he actually got into the Noah's kids. Yes, that's what they were actually arguing. Yeah. Lerner actually got into the area because of Edgar Cayce. That Edgar Cayce and the notion of Atlantis and their attitudes about the pyramids. He had his education funded by the Cayce Foundation and all of that. And then he went over to Egypt and actually started studying stuff. And that's when he had to give up all the idiocy that he had learned under the Edgar Cayce model. So that's a different way into the same zone. And he has alluded to that in various things about his epiphanies and that. And so it's a direct counterpart of young Earth creationists who have explained what has caused them to go, yeah, no. And it's a big, long list. I mean, if you think of just recently on YouTube, I mean, Erica Gutsick-Gibbon is former young Earth creationist. She came from that background. Paulogia comes from that background. Dapper Dino comes from that background. So there's an awful lot of that. I am the weird kid on the block, like, duh. Because I did not come from a young Earth creationist upbringing. I didn't come from a religious upbringing at all. So I was popping into it kind of from the side, looking at the creationism movement that was occurring kind of over in a corner during the 1980s. And then the intelligent design movement came along in the 1990s. And it was studying the intelligent design movement. And Richard Milton, who's a young Earth creationist without being religious over in Britain, he went in a direction that I could have gone if I had never discovered sound method, because quite a lot of the stuff that Richard Milton was writing in his various books is eerily similar to the idiot beliefs that I had coming out of high school, and that I eventually had to give up on because the facts didn't fit. Well, I think dear old Milton never quite grew up, so he seemed stuck on that. So if you start thinking, oh, another thing I'll be curious to find out about from the gang at Rathdrum, Idaho, and CMI's talk tomorrow or today, depending on how you look at it, is how much are they paying attention to the hunts for Noah's Ark, the physical remnants of it? And particularly, are they familiar with the NAMI episode, NAMI? It's an acronym for this group. They're Korean creationists who are accused by other creationists, including Andrew Snelling, of faking this site up in Mount Ararat that has been photographed, and so making it like a movie set. And needless to say, there's a small block of acolytes who have just launched onto this. But when you look at the whole long history of ark hunting, particularly since 1950, within my lifetime, in other words, and some of the often very bright and dedicated people who just keep going. Some of them still insist for a Mount Ararat site. Others have given that up. Andrew Snelling, for example, sits down and goes, excuse me, but according to our model, there was no Mount Ararat until after the flood, and therefore it can't possibly have remnants of the Noah's Ark on it. Now, can you? Ha ha. And so when you start comparing the notes as to what one creationist argues versus another, not that Snelling is an oracle. One of the things that I hope to discuss, I hope one of the people there is familiar with Andrew Snelling. I would be fascinated if Gillis isn't aware of Andrew Snelling. Yes, Ancient, yes, Netflix. That's the thing that Hancock has done. Mostly learning old places that exist, and I've heard of. Yes, that's the only minor benefit of these shows, is because they often poke around at really often interesting sites. They've got some shots of Ketlehuliak and a lot of these other places that are of interest. And there's wonderful archaeological work not being done by Hancock or any of the people associated with him, but nonetheless, it's, some Catholic beliefs mixed into the bag. Catholicism is kind of curious because as the old kid on the block, it has a different aspect in relation to science. They, of course, had that little problem with the Galileo and that stuff that came along. But you still find, especially among extremely conservative Roman Catholics, they're the ones that don't like Vatican II and think that Pope Francis is way too liberal. Those people can easily be full-out creationists. They can even easily be geocentrists, and even some might be flat earthers. Although you often find some Protestants in that ballpark in that too. So it's an interesting bit to look at the various demographics and movement of it. Needless to say, there's going to be a hell of a lot of stuff in Roxford there too. I've busy completing up the master kind list and working out background information as to getting a listing to find out are they leaving stuff off the list, and or are they listing things by old names and why they're listing them in the order that they are, and all of that. So that stuff is being accumulated. There's a newer paper that's come out just recently from a creationist who actually kind of looks at all these extinct mammal families, and he's sort of laying down a checklist that people ought to be paying attention to. I'll be wanting to compare that master list with mine once I get all of the information up. So anyway, awful lot to do, and there's going to be an awful lot of fun little appendices. One of the other appendices that finally grew to the point where I realized it was too big for an info box is on the diseases and carnivory and stuff, and the existence of parasites and the like. There's a relatively small creationist literature that's kind of tiptoed into that area, and it's tremendously silly rationalizing. They basically say, well, don't bother us about it. It's all due to Adam's sin, so shut up. But it gets to be some really tendentious arguments. And then you can contrast that with the actual technical literature and realize that parasites and others have gone way back, and we can see predation going on. Creationists, modern creationists actually are pretty much moving off the no carnivory until after the flood. They don't want any carnivory until after the sin. But since the sin could have occurred like a week after creation, if you are, I mean, there's no indication of the time frame between Adam and Eve being created and Eve eating the apple and they get shot out of the place. It can't be terribly long because it's only 1,000 years or so down to the flood. So it could have been a week, it could have been a month. The Bible is extremely vague on this, but certainly not in a tremendously long period of time. So they can have carnivory from that point on, in which case all the carnivores have to originate from that point down to the point where they're being preserved in the flood. So you got some really amazing stuff going on there. Yes, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Health. Yes. Well, it reminds me of the family joke. We have a bunch of Mormons back in the family, and there's a store, the ZCMI in Salt Lake, and there may be branches all around Utah. And it's a mercantile something or other. It stands for something. But in our family, the joke was it was the Zion Collection of Mormon Idiots. So I didn't make that one up. So apparently it makes the round. Yes, pirates are the residents of, yes, parasites. Yes, the parasites are from the Paris, the residents of France's capital city, or from the various other Paris that are around in the various places. And you do not want to look inside of a person from Paris, because who knows what could be in there, the little worms and all of that, tardigrades and nematodes and all of that. So yeah, I think, Purple, if you wrote that up and put Bible quotes in it, you could probably sell it to some of the people who currently do YouTubes. I don't know whether or not Standing for Truth would follow that, but if Nathaniel Jeanson said so, he'd go with it, I think. So anyway, so that puts us up to speed on where we plan on doing on the thing. I think I covered about everything on the oh, not quite. I got sidetracked from some of the background information. This will all be put up in the main link. That there has to do with, right off the bat, I was interested with a particular claim he was making, Jeanson, about the population of the Earth, particularly back at 1000 BCE. And by the way, he always uses just BC rather than BCE. At least, oh God, yeah, oh yeah. As H.L. Mencken said back in the 1920s, nobody ever lost a dime underestimating the intelligence of the American public, and I think that applies to YouTube as well. So, the Jeanson piece claimed that the population at 1000 BCE was 50 million, and I found that an intriguing number, and I wanted to find out what he was doing. Well, he cited a 1978 book on demographics, which he actually occasionally refers to as 1975, but his bibliography has 1978, so not completely attentive to the little fiddly bit details. But, human beings make mistakes. I make mistakes. Even some of my books have some typographical errors. So these things have. Heredity from one of the biblical tribes. Yes, that's another bit that we go into, the racism angle in that comes from the curse of Ham and the pigeonholing of various cultures. Because remember, the Bible view, you only got the three families of the kids coming off of the ark plus Noah. Everybody's got to come from those. And so they follow the Bible books as to what these various houses developed and all that. Well, the problem is the Bible is referring only to the mythologies and folk tales of the area in their little itty bitty Middle Eastern enclave. What do they know about the Chinese and the Australasians and people in the Americas? So those aren't on their scope. But creationists have to put them on the scope. So they have to cram everybody into those little boxes. And that's presumably what Jeanson will be attempting to do in the new book that will be going through source by source by source, although it's a sparsely documented thing. Anyway, back to the population stuff. McEvedy and Jones is an older work, and you're wondering why he's using such an old work. I know from my own research, when I did stuff years ago, I have material from like the 1970s that I was collecting when I was just starting up on research. And if your brain never stops, you could easily just move beyond that and find more recent material. But if you're prone to just pulling the stuff out that you had researched years ago, that might mean that you would never think to look beyond that. Now, so I was tracking down what was the circumstance of this. Well, it turns out that McEvedy and Jones is not a bad source, but it's one of several sources, and it comes up in the Wikipedia entry on the matter, and I'll put a link up to that. One of three estimates that relate to that 1000 BC period. And it happens that McEvedy and Jones is the low one at 50 million. The other two are much higher, from the 100 to 150, 15 million range. And that relates in part to this Klein-Goldovich 2011 study that I'll be putting the link up to, which suggests 18 million people existed on the planet around 5000 BCE, which is 1,000 years before the creation of the Earth, according to YEC. But by birth of Christ time, it's 188 million. So how would it get to there? If it was a purely steady growth rate, which is probably unlikely, it probably had ups and downs, you would have about 170 million people added, which averages to a population of 155 million if you had a purely steady growth rate. Now, that's probably skewed to the wrong direction, that it probably stayed quite stable and then was growing more as urbanization was occurring in the Roman Empire and China and various other places that had population spurts with improved agriculture and so forth and so on. The lower 115 million value suggests that a faster growth rate would be occurring more recently, and that's perfectly reasonable. Now, it happens that the government census website, which Jeanson cites in another context, again, it's one of the few little things popped up in a little footnote a little bit later in the chapter, just a little bit after he brings up this 50 million value. That website accepts McEvedy and Jones as its one source, and it accepts that 50 million value. So it's possible that he was looking at that website and going, well, there you go, 50 million, there it is, all done. Without ever looking to see whether even the government census thing might be conservative. Yes, population growth was faster when you could take preteen times from the cities they conquered. Yes, there are the perks to being a voracious culture where you could do those sorts of things. Meanwhile, there was a work that occurred in 2008. Scott Manning decided to go through a whole bunch of different population studies and worked out population values for a variety of areas trying to calculate stuff. And he was basing it in part on McEvedy and others. And I will be putting a link up to the PDF that he comes up. He arrives at a value of around 124 million, which again, all would suggest that that 50 million thing is a lowball value. and a minimum, not a maximum. So I'm not entirely sure that Jeanson really depends on there being only 50 million people on the Earth in 1000 BCE, but nevertheless, it right off the bat is reminding us that he doesn't necessarily dive very deeply on these things. And the fact that so much of his work, third of it or more, is just stuff from generic sources rather than technical literature. And I want to see just what's he's culling from all of that. Will he be doing more quote mining in this book than he did in the previous book, where he did practically none? So it's going to be fun to kind of go through all of this stuff. So that kind of covers most of the material. It looks like we actually got in fine signal and almost a whole hour of stuff out of the way. Does anyone have any questions from our dear audience before I shut down and go to bed and plan to wake up really early to be able to get out to Rathdrum by 10 a.m. We'll see. So we're going to be dealing with the creationism thing next week. People from the shallow end of the gene pool tend to stay in the shallows. Yeah. Some of the stuff, one of the things I will point out about population growth is that it became an increasing haven for parasites and diseases. And so an awful lot of the dynamics of these things come about through the contact of people with other peoples and people with environments where they're having all sorts of little critters that are relatively benign in their native habitat, but turn out to be a problem if they have a new vector to play with. So the various papers have been analyzing the fact that that growth rate and some of the things in relation to a lot of vermin and the reason why we started domesticating cats and all that to go after rats and all of that, all having to do with people living in higher urban areas. Now, a different dynamic then, the cycle back to the Amazonia issue, is that the notion that because agriculture developed and generated authoritarian centralized states in the cultures that produced wheat and barley and rice and others in various spots, apparently isn't occurring in Amazonia, where the population densities remain quite low in small little enclave communities that have collectively a fairly large population, but nonetheless don't have the kind of centralized authorities that are going on because of the way they grow their crops and the way they irrigate. They don't need to worry about building stuff from large aqueducts and all that things that comes along with a lot of these centralized culture. Cats came for the food. They just decided to start sleeping in our houses when it got cold outside. You mean their purpose wasn't to eat our eyeballs? Oh, okay. Well, thank you. That's an important safety tip. We'll be reporting on all the material next week, and we'll be analyzing more. And is standing? Can anyone see whether Standing for Truth is still in the show, or has he skedaddled off somewhere else after his pointless little snark? If you are in there, do let us know when you start fact checking your source material. We haven't spotted you doing that previously, and it would be a very interesting thing to do because it's the 21st century, and you can do that now. You can gain the original primary sources. I do that. That's what the whole point of these books has been in that thing. And it's a wonderful practice because it keeps you from suffering from cranial blockage of the rectum. So it says he's still here. Well, he's probably taking down little notes and blah, 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 and see what happens to go along. Maybe he'll even do an hour and a half video discussing why he disagrees with the things that I point up and how I refuse to pay attention to all the stuff that I don't refuse to pay attention to. So anyway, we'll be seeing you all next week. We're supposedly going into a cold snap here after the weekend and going down into freezing weather again. And there's problems with people going over the pass and all that, I'm hunkered down here. Watch out for any aberrant weather conditions that may be bumping into you in other areas, and watch out for aberrant forms of Omicron and these various other things that can happen. But otherwise, enjoy the world, find out things, enjoy company of people, and we will see you next week. Au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, and do not accept any, not even one wooden penguin. You can't trust them. You just can't.